Chuck Casto, thanks so much for being here with me today.
It's great to be here.
Here in DC.
Yes.
Does it feel good to be back after being here for NRC for a few years?
It does. I enjoy the city. It's a great place.
Yeah. You miss being outside in the hot weather in a thick suit?
Well, I live in Atlanta, so I'm used to the hot weather, and I've lived here before. I know how it can get quite humid.
Yeah. It's even worse.
But it's not here yet. It's still early June.
Yeah.
So it's not too bad yet.
Yeah, we got you in here early enough that
right.
we didn't kill you.
Right. Good.
So normally we start off by going through the guest's background, but I just finished reading your book, Station Blackout.
Sure.
And there's so much information in it. It's so dense with a rich story about both your experience and the operators at Fukushima's experience that I wanted to start out with
Let's go
the
for
book.
it. Let's go for it. Yes.
So I was joking to you when you first came in about where you're working, because in the book you say that you were probably thinking of retiring and then Fukushima happened and you got called into action. And so I guess to start, how did Fukushima change your career?
Well, many of us, you're late in your career. Like I say in the book, you're late in your career. You're thinking about, is it time to fade away and let the other people take over and have their chance. So I was very close to retirement. In fact, I had contemplated retirement 3 times, and I just moved back to Atlanta and still contemplating retirement. And then I got the call to go to Japan, and after that, that pretty much turned my life over and my career from that point on.
Yeah.
And I spend much of my time still dealing with lessons learned, teaching, lecturing, do other activities associated with Fukushima. So it's still a huge part of my life.
Yeah. So do you feel like you've almost become a spokesperson on behalf of Fukushima?
Well, I think, know a lot, but I don't know that I would be the spokesperson, but I can speak to it, that's for sure.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like it's kind of cumbersome to talk about it now? Like you're like, oh, I want to just move past it. Like it was such a stressful period of time in my life. No,
I think it's such an important event for the industry that we can't forget. And it's funny because I was just at a university doing a lecture on Fukushima in Alabama, and there were undergrads. Mm-hmm. No one in the room remembered it.
Yeah.
Right? So you say, you remember in 2011 when Fukushima and the nuclear plant and all that, and they're all just staring at me like, we have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? So it's amazing how quickly the world moves on.
It is. Right. Yeah, and so I'm the age of those undergrads. I just graduated. Yeah. And to me, this job was my first job in the nuclear industry. And, we're always talking about Fukushima and Chernobyl and all these events. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, I kind of know what they are. And it's not until I dive into literature and books written by people like you that I understand how important they were. Right. And it's kind of crazy because I feel like in the nuclear industry and, people immediately affected by it, and then also the older population, it's such a huge event. It really sticks in your mind. And then there's this huge other half of people that don't have an impression.
Well, here we are just after D-Day, the anniversary, right? And how many people have no idea what happened at Normandy.
Yeah.
Right? No idea of the battles, no idea of, right? So the world moves on.
Yeah. But it is important to, like you said, to keep the story going and to talk about it more.
Right. And that's one of the reasons for writing the book, was to be an archive, so that future researchers, what happened back in 2011, and what it was, 50 years from now or even sooner, I guess, people will study Fukushima and they'll need all the literature they can. So I think there were 2 big reasons that I wrote the book. One, the operators at Fukushima Daiichi and Daini weren't able to tell their own story. They're not able to tell their own story
because of the environment.
Because they're considered villains, as I say in the book. And what they told me, we were considered Vietnam veterans. Like Vietnam veterans, of course, many people in the U.S. don't even remember Vietnam now. Yeah. But they feel like they're villains in their own country. Yeah. So to say, hey, we worked really hard, we struggled, and we gave it our all to work on this reactor, they can't do that.
Right.
So they wanted me, and I wanted to tell some of their story, not all of it, but some of their story, particularly from a leadership perspective. And then the other part of my desire to write the book was I wanted to archive what the Americans had done. Mm-hmm. Because that story's not been told, and what did the Americans do behind the scenes?
Right.
How did they support? So that was the real reasons for writing the book.
So how soon after the event did you write the book?
Well, it took years. The way I did it was I recorded myself. So I would tell a vignette. I might be driving on a long drive somewhere, and I'd turn on my recorder, and I'd tell a vignette. Mm-hmm. Because during the event, I did not have time to keep a journal. Right. I kept some notes. I went back and looked at my notes, and I'm like, oh, I don't even know what this means, right? Yeah. So most of my notes were just scribbled because we were just too busy to sit down every evening and write something, right?
Right.
So I just from memory, right, probably in somewhere around 2013, I guess, I started to tell the stories. Well, in 2012, I went to Japan and interviewed the operators. Mm-hmm. I spent a couple of weeks in Japan interviewing the people that I knew from the accident and the leaders. So I interviewed them, and that took some time. And to get that translated and then filter out, I contemplated, do I just publish the interviews or do I do something different, right? So I ended up doing something different, telling the story through their eyes rather than their interview. So that took some time to tell that story, and then to try to blend what's happened at Daiichi at the same time with the events at Daini, trying to blend those stories together was very difficult. It took probably a year and a half, fact checking and all that. So it took years to put it together.
But you put it in this nice digestible, it's like 170-page book. Right. And it's really great. It's super dense with information. It's almost like I feel like I know like what you guys ate and like what you guys felt every day.
Right.
The process.
Yeah, right. And well, it was a real balance between being too technical, right, and having it accessible. So I tried to strike a balance that people in the nuclear industry could get something out of it, but yet my sister or somebody a friend down the street could read it. And they struggle. There's a couple chapters in there that the common people, non-nukes, that they struggle getting through. But if they just hold on, a few acronyms, that was a problem. And then the second edition, we actually we had the index with acronyms in it, but the second edition we actually put a list of acronyms. Yeah. Because I had that comment so many times. Boy, I wished I had a list of the acronyms. So we did. That is in the second edition, but it was a real balance of trying to not make it too technical. Mm-hmm. The operators, in fact, told me when I talked with them, they said, we don't want to tell you the story about what switches we flipped and what dials we turned or anything. What we want to tell you is the emotional story behind it, the leadership story. And I said, that's perfect. That's because the technical part about what pumps were started or what happened technically has been told many times. Right. But what really I think was important for Access for Americans was that behind-the-scenes story, that emotional story.
And I think a really interesting point that you make in the book is almost how the leadership and emotional story affects what switches were flipped. I loved the part where you talked about at Daini, did I pronounce that right? Daini. At Daini, the control operator would have exercise classes, and he'd slowly start to introduce all 3 meals throughout the day instead of giving them all 3 meals at once to introduce them to a normal life again. Right. Amazing.
Yes, Masuda was great. He knew exactly how to push the gas pedal and the brake. He was really good at judging what type of situational leadership, I think we would call it. What's the situation and what type of leadership skill do I need for this situation? And it's funny because I use that in the class, the bento box story. So the restaurant offered him 3 bento boxes a day for all the workers, and he chose to only take 1 at a time. So I do that in a class often. I'll ask him, what would you do? Would you have taken all 3 of them, or would you have taken the 1 at a time and slowly introduce food? Most people that I talk to said we would take all 3 of them. Yeah. Right. But then you'd probably end up with waste and all kinds of problems, right? So I don't know what the right answer is, but it's interesting to go through the dialogue of how you make those decisions.
Yeah. And it was a significant decision because they were in that plant for over a month.
Right.
With, like limited access to water and showers.
Right. Very little food, very little supplies. And, it's a first world nation. That's how desperate the situation was. You're talking about a first world nation. And the tsunami damage and the first responders, they were gone. And, even the ports, when the plan for a big tsunami like that, and an earthquake, was for hospital ships to come into the ports. Mm-hmm. And the ports were gone.
Yeah.
Right. So they could. The whole plan. My point is, the entire emergency plan that they had for this event, from the earthquake and tsunami and nuclear plant, really went out the window that day.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know this, but what boggles me is how they could predict that the tsunami was going to be like 10 feet high, and then it was some like 50, 60 feet high.
Right.
How does that prediction, how was it so off?
Right. I've never delved into that, why the prediction was so off, but the earth slip was about just over 57 meters.
It's crazy.
Yeah, that's a pretty big slip in the continental shelf.
Yeah.
It created 3 sets of tsunami waves. So if you think that, so it broke in 3 places. So maybe the prediction was, if they were calculating 1 break, mm-hmm. and so that's what that wave would have been. But the problem was that the Earth actually broke in 3 places. Wow. And each one of those created a set of tsunami waves. Yeah. So then they added, and then they were additive.
Right.
So they hadn't predicted, 3 breaks.
Yeah. It's a terrible event.
Oh, horrific.
How does it look now? Because I know you went back.
Yeah, things are, I said, like I say in the book, one of the times I was back there, I almost missed my train because of a traffic jam. And as I sat there in the car, as we were going back to the train station, I thought to myself, this is the best traffic jam I've ever been in, because it's a sign of life. Yeah. Right. Highway 6 was abandoned for years. You couldn't get on it. The road that goes past both Daini and Daiichi. So Highway 6 was closed for a long time, and then it reopened, and traffic, and I'm like, this is perfect. I love this traffic jam. I'm happy to miss my train for this traffic jam. So it's, but there's some downsides. People, they're putting the tsunami wall along the coastline there in Sendai, and it's a huge tsunami wall. Mm-hmm. So there's some anger by the people about, if you had oceanfront property, right? Now you look at this, you can't even see the ocean. Yeah. There's a staircase that goes up the wall. You go across the wall and down the other side, but they've lost all their oceanfront view for a lot of places along the coastline. So, and certainly the evacuated area and the contaminated area, that's just been completely devastated. But a lot of that land has been remediated, and life is returning.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about the evacuation area.
Yes.
Because it's kind of crazy, another prediction on behalf of NRC for the evacuation radius to be 50 miles. Right. Or 50 miles, even though in the regulations it's only 10? 10, right. Why 5 times larger?
Well,
even though they didn't go with that.
Yeah, you're right. So one of the biggest reasons was we just didn't have enough information. So we think that an accident here, we would have information, and we would know what was going on. I think in particular, one of the strongest programs for the United States is the NRC's Resident Inspector Program, where you have someone independent who works there at the site and is available at the site to talk to the government and to talk to the president and talk to the chairman of the NRC and say, these are the conditions.
This is an American citizen in Japan.
Well, if in the U.S., so in our U.S. plants, we have the Resident Inspector Program. So that resident inspector, but in Japan, they don't have a resident inspector program that has this independent view of what the situation is and independence. So, and that's what caused a lot of the confusion. That's the reason Prime Minister Khan had to go to the site in the middle of the accident, because he had lost confidence in his own leadership from the government level. So he had to go for himself and go talk to Yoshida for himself. So my point is, one of the reasons we had a bigger area than we would in the United States was because, as people said at the time, we don't own those plants. So, and we don't have the information that we would have in the U.S.
Right.
There were so many different models, projection models. It's worse than projecting a hurricane. The models were all over the place, right? 200 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 10 kilometers. So the models were everywhere.
Yeah.
So you have to reach what you think's a reasonable distance. In my mind, basically what we were saying with that 80-kilometer decision was we were telling American citizens, don't go into that area, right? So the Japanese are trying to evacuate people out to about 18 miles, whatever it is, and so they were trying to get people out, and what we were trying to say is don't get in their way.
Right.
Right. Don't get in their way. Don't go up there and try to figure out what's going on, or go see it, or go anything. So don't. So it was sort of like a buffer area outside. Let the Japanese deal with their people in there, and it's sort of a buffer area. So there were a number of reasons I think we settled on that evacuation. That, as I say in the book, I think there were a couple of problems. You know, if you look at the circle that you draw, it bisects some big cities. It cuts off. So, you know, just randomly coming up with that number probably wasn't a good idea. The other good thing about it is my personal visits to that area, and I'd ask people about the difference between the U.S. and the Japanese, and there was the people I talked to, the citizens, they didn't even know about the American, right? So
Yeah.
you know, it was sort of a Washington and media crisis,
Right.
not a real crisis.
Yeah.
It didn't really have an impact on the ground.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I feel like another point that you bring up in the book is you guys putting all this, the United States, putting all this time and effort into developing a solution, but really all you did is help the Japanese develop their own solution,
Right.
and they use their own solution
That's
pretty
right.
much in place of yours.
Right.
So what do you think that was? Was it almost like they needed that friendship to like hold their hand and get through it?
Well, I think, you know, at first we acted like Americans. I say in the book, you know, Americans go into a situation in an international country and they analyze it, you know, and then they boss.
Yeah.
Right. So they get the data, they analyze it, then they say, this is what you need to do, right? So we tried that, and that didn't work, right? I immediately saw in about the first few days, that's not working. So as I say in the book, you have to go and you have to talk. It doesn't matter if it's your children, your relatives, a friend, whatever it is. Go talk with them. See the problem as they see it.
Yeah.
So I call it listen, learn, help. Help them with the problem as they see it. And then you can build some trust and maybe lead them, right?
Right.
But so the specific example was flooding the reactor containment building. We kept demanding that's what the procedures require. This is what you need to do. We know, and right. And then I went and I listened to them rationalize why they couldn't flood the containment, and it came to me. I was, they're right. They can't flood the containment.
Why couldn't?
Right? Well, there were too many breaks in the containment building, and they didn't have instrumentation to know if they overfilled it. They were afraid to overflow because of the breaks, and it would go out to the ocean. So there was a lot of reasons they couldn't flood the containment, and I recognized that in that meeting. And I thought, So I go back and tell my team, let's never bring that up again. Right, and at that point, we developed the mantra: listen, learn, help, and lead.
Yeah.
And so let's follow that. So you just help them with what's the next step. What are you trying to accomplish right now that we can help you with? What's the next step? Not, you know, way out there, but what is the very next step that you're trying to accomplish, and how can we help?
Right.
Right, incremental.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the model we have ultimately developed.
Did you see a difference once you started applying that model?
Right, and you know, we started having the meetings with the cabinet of the Japanese government on about the 21st, and they were worried because they were afraid we were going to go into this meeting and just pound the table and direct and say, you're not doing this right, you're not doing this. So I led, I guess, the first meeting, and I told our team, we're not going to say anything.
Good.
We're not going to say a word. So we opened the meeting.
First step is listen.
Right. Well, it's right. First step is listen. So we opened the meeting, and I expressed remorse. Sorry for your loss, and congratulations, I found something that was positive, right? So congratulations on your success. Then they briefed us, and literally we shut down the meeting, right? So that gave them confidence. They said, okay, let's try this again tomorrow night. Right? So we did them at night for a lot of different reasons. Late at night, we had these meetings with some of it was to keep out of the media eye.
Yeah.
And because it wouldn't have been a good picture at the time that the Americans were so involved. The Japanese government, I think, they wanted to be sure to say, we're in charge here. We're not, the Americans are not in charge. Right. They've had that before, and they didn't want to see that again.
Yeah.
Right. So we met late at night, and we gradually got to the point, as I say in the book, we gradually got to the point where we started asking questions. But I always opened up with remorse and congratulations on some success that happened during the day.
Right.
And then asked for permission to ask a question. Right?
Yeah.
And then eventually,
very
right, that's right. And over time, and then we started to develop some jokes. Hosono, their leader, and I, some inside jokes with each other and stuff, right? So you started to develop that rapport, and things went much better after that. The relationship was much better.
Yeah.
Right, and so we could advise, and they could push back or whatever it was. So.
Yeah, and I think that it's important you bring up too, first saying your condolences, because a big part of extreme crisis leadership, or at least what I got from your book, is understanding that all these people are working in that operator room. They could have families that are going to be gone by the time that they get out, and they just don't know. And that affects how you work every day.
That's right. I'm glad you took that away, because that's a huge takeaway, that not only were they workers and involved, they were victims.
Right.
So when you go in to a situation from out of the country, these aren't just people that are working this problem. These people that are victims of the problem. So you have to watch, how you speak, how you act, what you do, because they're still trying to go through that victim process at the same time. And they still are. I interviewed operators 2 or 3 years later, and it's clear to me, and I'm no medical doctor, but they have PTSD. I'd interview these operators 3 years later, and they break down. We have to stop the interview and let them gather themselves. So 3 or 4 years later, they're still emotional about that, of what they went through.
Do you ever, sort of experience that? Because you did visit the plant during the event.
I still am just, my takeaway is we can never let this happen again. When you see that level of damage, and when you drive through those evacuated zones, and you see front doors of homes open, and coffee cups still on a counter, and children's toys out in the yard, and it's all evacuated, there's nobody around, and then you see the level of devastation that was caused by the plume. What goes through, it does get emotional. You say, I recommit myself to it every time, is we cannot let this happen ever again. It just cannot happen. As I said in the book, no more heroes. We appreciate the heroes. We're grateful for what they did there, Browns Ferry, other places, but we would never want to put anybody in a position where they need to take heroic action.
Right. And so one thing that I've noticed about the industry, or a lot of the reason young people are getting into the industry, is because nuclear power is clean, and so it can be a way that we help reverse climate change. But on the same token, climate change can be some of the big reasons that nuclear fails, right? Because we are going to be more prone to these extreme weather events, whether it's in Japan or elsewhere in the world, and things like saltwater intrusion, flooding nuclear plants. And so how do we prevent this from not happening again? Because it seems a little out of our control.
Right. Well, we've done quite a bit of analysis on external events, since this taught us more about external events than we knew every time. The good thing about the American nuclear industry is we learn from others, and we learn from ourselves, and we apply corrective actions and effective corrective actions. After the 3 Mile Island accident, we we laid on hundreds and hundreds of new requirements, and we realized over a time, okay, those were not effective. And it took us 20 years to undo them, right? So in this case, what we want to do is learn from it and use effective corrective actions. Someone asked me this week actually about that, and whether I was satisfied whether we've done enough in the United States. We can always look to do more, but I think the flexible equipment storage and the off-site and all that, flex was a good answer to help, so that we didn't have to have 1,000 different little changes. That one, to expand the capability of our industry by having flex that can be brought into the site if there's an external event. That is a very elegant solution. Otherwise, you have to make thousands of little changes at the plant. But in this case, the flex can be brought in and offset any hazard that happens. And in terms of prevention, I think we've looked hard at external events and put in appropriate countermeasures for external events. I feel comfortable about that. We don't have some of the, 70%, over 70% of the Japanese are exposed to some kind of external hazard. And it's in the United States, it's less than 10% of the people who are exposed to a big hazard like an earthquake, or so it's quite a unique place.
Yeah.
And if you see the Ring of Fire, there are some videos out there that'll show you the Ring of Fire and how active it is, what an active area is. So to build nuclear plants there is a little more challenging than it is in a more stable environment that we have in the United States.
All right. So why do you think that they would pursue nuclear?
Why what the Japanese did?
Yeah.
Well, they're, of course, an island nation. Very few natural resources to produce electricity, and with the growth that was going on post-war, to rebuild the country, you need a lot of power.
Quickly,
so you got
yeah.
high-density power source and nuclear to put in quick at that time, quick to build, and in high density. You don't have many natural resources, a good environmental friendly technology. So
Right.
why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Right?
It's good. The question is, why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't you? Right.
Yeah. So what kind of impression did you get on Japan's nuclear industry as compared to the U.S. nuclear industry?
Well, I think they recognized, and we recognized prior to the accident, the regulator was not effective. I'm a believer that, and not just because I'm a prior regulator,
Yeah.
right? But
Just sways your opinion a bit, though.
yeah, it may be biased a
little
little bit, right? But I believe any industry reflects, if it's a regulated industry, they reflect their regulator.
Mm-hmm.
If the regulator's lax, the industry will be lax. If the regulator's firm, they'll be firm, right? And unfortunately, their structure in Japan for the regulator was not strong. It essentially was a pre-1974 where promotion and regulation was in the same group together. So there's, this group's trying to promote and regulate at the same time.
Yeah.
And they still, even today, they have a rotation policy where people are rotated out about every 3 years. So there's a lot of churn in the regulator and in the government.
Every 3 years.
Right.
It's quite a
so
bit.
Typically you'll get a new job every 2 or every 3 years. And
Which
so
is how long it takes you to get used to a job.
That's right. So there's a lot of churn. That still exists today, the churn. But they've moved the regulator to the Ministry of Environment, MEX, and taken it out of the promotion, right? So there's some independence there.
Yeah.
Right? So they've given the regulator more authority. In my view, in Japan, so what they did was they swung the pendulum all the way over to the regulator. So the regulator is now responsible for everything, responsible for safety, oversight, everything. And eventually you've got to get that pendulum back in the middle where the utility is responsible for safety and the regulator provides effective oversight to that, right? So the pendulum's in the middle. It's a balanced system.
Yeah.
And right now it's still way too far over one side, in my opinion, in Japan.
is it maybe because Fukushima made people lose trust in TEPCO?
That's right, or trust in the nuclear industry, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's rational, that happens. But over time, you've got to build trust back in the utility, so that you can have that effective check and balance or balance. And so far, that's really not happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder if you could go into more about like the role that Japan's regulator played during Fukushima and the role that the government played and the role that TEPCO played, because I feel like sometimes the more that I learn about Fukushima and events like Chernobyl, people just say, oh, it was basically a miscommunication issue and everything might have been fine if we just communicated better, but the sort of solution to how to communicate better can be very unclear, which I think is what you're trying to do in this book, is give people a solution to extreme crisis leadership. But I guess how would you sum up that solution?
Well, that's a tough question because the regulator was challenged prior to the accident, and it was more than a communications issue. It was an effectiveness issue, and it was a competence issue, and right. So and also within the government. Mm-hmm. And the government's knowledge of these nuclear plants and how they operate and what is a spent fuel pool, that wasn't there.
Right.
Wasn't there.
Because they just don't have time to learn about every industry in that depth.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So when you talk about the government, Nicole, when you talk about the government emergency response system, they didn't have a system like we have where they have an emergency response organization, and then the individual industry comes in and sits at the table, right, if it's nuclear. So our national response plan, it's called. So they didn't have that. So they really didn't have any structure to be able to respond to I shouldn't say any, but little structure to respond to this catastrophe. And again, you have to go back to, as I've said before, this event, I don't think outside of war, mankind has ever faced the forces of physics and the forces, of nature that these people face. So, I always say I'm very careful because, if you look at the Great San Francisco Fire, if you look at Hurricane Katrina, you look at Three Mile Islands, they had all of those all at one time and more, right? And we didn't do very well on any of those, right? we weren't stellar on any of those. So, to second guess their response. But I would say, again, that without that resident inspector program, when Kahn, he lost confidence in academia, who was giving him advice. He lost confidence in the regulator, the rest of his government, the utility. So there's some things that I don't agree with Kahn about, the prime minister and what he did, but I understand the situation he was in was pretty desperate.
Right.
And so I wouldn't second guess that, given the severity of that accident.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be difficult for him as well, because it's not like what's happening at the nuclear plant is the only thing that's happening after an earthquake and a tsunami, right?
Right. That's right. And they were worried about Tokyo. If Tokyo needed to be evacuated, right?
Those
were the kind of things,
right?
And the fear that was going on, and all the fear in the subway stations, and from the earthquake, right, and in the building, and evacuating people, and of course, the tsunami was the greatest impact on people and lost lives, but the earthquake too, right? And I know that some of the evacuations, the issue was critical care patients, getting them evacuated. Well, in Japan, you can't use an elevator if there's been an earthquake until an elevator person comes in and certifies that it's safe.
Oh,
so they tried to move critical care patients down staircases, and people died from being moved down staircases, right? So there's just the immense challenges of it all.
Yeah.
Right, that he was dealing with wasn't just as you say, Nicole, wasn't just the nuclear plant. It's the damage from that tsunami, and the earthquake was over 16,000 people lost.
Wow. So I have a seemingly simple question.
Right.
Why even evacuate anybody?
Well, you mean for the nuclear part, or
For the nuclear part,
yeah. Well, there are papers. There are a lot of people out there who say the sheltering would have been satisfactory.
Yeah.
There was no need, maybe in certain areas, much smaller area, but at the time, you didn't know what's next because things, you see buildings explode, plumes, and then you ask yourself what's next, how big it is, how big is it going to get, how big of a problem. So I think that was a prudent judgment that they made to evacuate those people. But today you look at it after in hindsight, it's easy.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy in hindsight to look and say, well, they didn't really need to evacuate those people or as many as they did. But you don't have that foresight.
Yeah. Do we know how the people in Japan felt about having to evacuate?
Well, most of them wanted to get away from that nuclear plant.
Yeah, right? They were like happy.
They were happy to get away from that nuclear plant. And they did, and they found shelter. And as you know, it's probably 40% of the people have come back. And that's mostly the elderly have come back.
Because they feel connected to it.
Right.
Yeah.
The young have moved on.
Right.
They're playing Fortnite in Tokyo or something, right?
Yeah, much simpler life for them.
That's right. So they don't. But that's a big problem demographically in Japan right now, is the youth are moving to the big cities. Mm-hmm. They have the highest real estate numbers in terms of vacant homes than they've ever had.
Wow. Because
the elderly pass. The home is there. The kids have gone to the big cities, and we don't need that home. We're not going out there to farm and do all that. We're in the big city, right? So they have a population problem to begin with. The numbers are declining, but that's another problem. Is that the migration to the big cities.
Mm-hmm. Do we see a lot of younger people starting to study nuclear and learn how to operate the nuclear plants?
Well, I saw statistics the other day that the number of PhD students in the U.S. in nuclear is like the highest it's been forever. Yes.
Good.
Yeah, that's right.
It's exciting.
That's right. So, and it, I think it's a great industry for the youth to get into. But as you said, Nicole, it's a clean technology. It's there is a future. And there's a future, I think, in the U.S. And I would encourage the youth to get into the field, help us make it safer.
Yeah.
Right. I probably shouldn't tell this story. There's an environmental engineer. I was on a flight with environmental engineer. She was just graduating from undergrad in environmental engineer.
Yeah.
And I said something about, why don't you get into nuclear? She was talking about what field she might get into. So why don't you get into the nuclear business or get into gas? And she was appalled. I don't think she wanted to talk to me the rest of the flight. She was like, no, those are awful industries, right? And I said, no, wait a minute, think about this, right? If you think that way, why don't you go in and help make things better?
Yeah.
Right? That they want to just go to the green stuff, and that's understandable. But so no, there's opportunities. Come in, help us make the industry even cleaner than it is.
Yeah.
It's one of the cleanest tech. If you want to be green, go nuclear.
Go nuclear.
Right.
Yeah. Did you know that I was an environmental engineering
student?
No, I didn't know. And I just graduated.
I don't think you were the one on the flight, though.
No, it wasn't me. But it is, we have this misconception, I think, that, nuclear is dirty in a lot of different ways, and waste and pollution, and it's not so much.
So if you want a green career, you go nuclear.
Go nuclear.
Right.
Yeah. So we were talking about getting involved in the industry. It's time for your backstory.
Oh.
How did you get involved in the industry?
I was in the Air Force. I left when I graduated high school. I enlisted in the Air Force.
Oh, wow.
And a long story, but I was looking for adventure, right?
Yeah.
And part of my job in the Air Force was to work with nuclear weapons. Mm. So I got interested in the nuclear weapons program, and then I thought, well, maybe I'll just when I leave the Air Force, I'll stay in the nuclear weapons business. But then the nuclear power industry, being a civilian industry, attracted me. I thought, I knew some people that were working in a nuclear power plant, and so I went and I got a job as a construction person,
To construct nuclear.
Yes. I know you're shocked because I look way too young to have done that, but I did what's called dropping brass. You know, you have an employee ID that's a little brass ID, little brass. So you talk to people in the nuclear industry today and say, "You ever drop brass?" They have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. So what is this?
So it's your little employee ID on a brass circle. Right. So when you go into the construction site,
on your
you drop
finger?
it. No, it's just a little disc.
Okay.
So when you go into the plant, you dump it in a bucket, and they know you're there. That's your time card.
It's kind of
like
scary.
punching a time card.
Oh, it's a time card. It's not like in case you die. It's
It's just a time. It's just a time card. So you drop brass, and then you come in at night, and you come back out at night and pick it up, and they know that you've been at the site, working. So I dropped brass for a long time as a construction guy, and then eventually went into plant operations, was an equipment operator. Loved that job. Not saying I was very good. I'm just saying I loved the job.
We hope you're good at it. I'm sure you're good at it.
And out in the plant for a lot of years and manipulating valves and doing all the stuff that equipment operators did. Went to the control room, was a reactor operator. Then I really shifted over and became an instructor, and was an instructor at a couple of different sites, and then jumped to the regulator, gave operator exams, and the rest is history.
That's great. So all of your experience came from like first hands-on experience with nuclear. Right. It's not like you studied it and then went into the field.
No.
You just went right into it.
I went right into it and
worked your way up.
Weighed in. Yes. And, we used to cut nuclear weapons in half and that kind of stuff, right? So you're working, talk about hands-on with uranium and beryllium and all the other, bomb components, and then jump over and use your hands out in the plant to manipulate valves, right? So just jump in. So I think that's one of the areas I like most is that I've had hands-on experience.
Right. So was Fukushima, or helping deal with Fukushima, one of the pinnacles of your career? Or did you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I said, I was sitting there thinking about. It was a regulatory information conference here in D.C. that week when it happened to Rick.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm watching people talk and everything. So, okay, this is it. This is my last Rick. I'm done.
You're like dozing off, like doodling.
Yeah, I'm just looking around at all the people, all my friends and everything. So, well, I'm going to miss this, but this is it. I'm done. This is my third time thinking about it.
Yeah.
This time I'm done. A week later or so, I'm on an airplane to Japan.
Amazing.
It's been a big part of my life since then.
Yeah. I really enjoyed your book, first of all.
Oh,
and I'm so glad that you wrote it.
Thank you.
Because in a world where everything lives on the internet, it's hard to get a cohesive story about big events like this. That being said, I'm going to bring pop culture into this.
Okay.
So there's a new series called Chernobyl from HBO and Sky.
Right.
Yesterday I was looking at the podcast app, the Apple Podcast app, and reading some of the reviews for their podcast. And a lot of people are talking about making a season 2 for Fukushima.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you think would be an appropriate way for somebody to, make Fukushima a pop culture show? How would they get the right information represented in a way that we could feel proud, of our involvement in Fukushima?
I think that the first thing is to not make it. I don't know if I can say this, but not make it a Mark Wahlberg movie.
You can say that.
Can I say that?
You can say that.
Okay, great actor, and certainly great actor, but his movies are blow up and car chases and all that stuff, right? And if you look at a movie like Hurt Locker,
I've heard of it, haven't seen it.
Yes, and the lady who produced Hurt Locker, it's a very thoughtful movie, thought piece, but it has action, right? So I think if you were going to do a series about Fukushima, you really, and actually I haven't watched the Chernobyl, I haven't had time to watch the Chernobyl series, and I've had people talk with me, even this week, nuclear industry people who thought it was great.
Yeah.
And not because of the technical part of it, but because of the interplay with the government and all the behind the scenes stuff, right? So I think you just have to keep it a thought piece. right? That would be the big thing. You can still have action and things that happen and stuff, but you got to keep it a thought piece.
Yeah. Great. And so you said you were going to retire. You didn't retire.
Right.
You helped deal with Fukushima. What do you do after? And what do you hope to do a few years down the line in the industry?
Well, that's a tough question. Because every time I've contemplated doing something different, I didn't. So I'll probably continue on with what I'm doing right now. But academia. If I can go teach executive MBA, something like that, it'd be something different to do.
Yeah.
And help somebody grow. So that's what you want to try to do, leave some kind of legacy.
Yeah, so it seems like Fukushima taught you more about leadership and business than it did about nuclear.
Right. Well, yes, but I think the important takeaway for me is the leadership part of it. Right. And so taking that to an executive MBA program somewhere or something would be, I think, helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Crisis leadership training or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not going to retire?
I don't know. In case my wife watches this, I gotta say yes, Nicole. Yes, absolutely, I'm retiring. Absolutely.
No, that's great.
Beverly.
So what have you learned from the industry post Fukushima? Has there been any changes in how we regulate, how we operate?
Well, I think so. We talked about the flex. Flex is a big deal, and good solution. And I think everyone, when we look back in the industry, reflects on the we can't let this happen again, right? Because again, it's a reminder that it can't happen. Yeah. And that when at the time when you think something can't happen, that's when it's going to happen, right? So I think it's, besides all the technical things we've done and all the policy things we've done, we've just got to keep reflecting back and remembering D-Day. That's why we have these celebrations about D-Day and stuff. But just remember, that's reminding ourselves, or 9/11 or whatever it is, just reminding ourselves of the special nature of the technology that we're dealing with. Yeah. And we owe that to the American people, to always remember that it's a privilege to operate these plants, and we have an obligation to operate them safely.
Right. And how do we go about remembering Fukushima? What's the best thing that we can do?
Well, I think the industry's inculcated a lot of Fukushima lessons learned into their training material, and that's building it, integrating it into the one-time remembrance is not enough. You've got to build it into your procedures and build it into the safety culture of the facility.
Right.
So doing that is the best thing you can do to make sure it's sustainable.
What do you think of this, if someone were to say Fukushima proved that nuclear was safe?
Well, it proves that we have effective emergency planning.
Yeah.
Right? That you can evacuate people. They did evacuate people. So we do have, so we spend all of our effort to make sure that there's not an accident, and we have many countermeasures to do that. We've got well-trained people, and the probability is low, but if it's not, then we have emergency planning. And we have, in the United States, I think, a very effective emergency planning program. And so that contributes, that's part of the element of keeping the American people safe.
Yeah. And soon we'll have Chuck Casto teaching extreme crisis leadership around the globe.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
Chuck, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.